Ariel Stanton had always been the kind of man who handled things on his own. A retired Navy officer with decades of experience in high-pressure situations, he had seen the worst humanity had to offer and lived to tell the tale. He had been stationed in war zones, commanded men in life or death situations, and faced moments that would break the average person. But after leaving the military, he had promised himself a different kind of life, one that was quiet, structured, and free of unnecessary conflict. That was why he had chosen to settle in a gated suburban community, a place that promised security, order, and rules that were supposed to keep everything running smoothly. It was the kind of place where people kept their lawns neatly trimmed, their driveways clear of clutter, and their homes looking almost identical in an effort to maintain a pleasant and uniform aesthetic. At first, it seemed like the perfect place for a man like him, someone who valued discipline, control, and stability. But he had underestimated just how much control the so-called community board had over the people who lived there. It wasn't long before he started noticing the subtle ways in which they exerted their authority. First, it was small things, notes left on mailboxes reminding homeowners about minor infractions, such as leaving their trash cans out a few hours too long or using the wrong type of grass fertilizer. Then, there were the mandatory meetings where residents were encouraged to attend and voice their opinions, though it quickly became clear that dissent wasn't exactly welcome. Rules weren't just enforced, they were weaponized. Homeowners who didn't comply with every minor regulation would suddenly find themselves dealing with absurd fines, arbitrary restrictions, and endless bureaucratic obstacles. And the one who ran it all was Arthur Grayson, the board's president, a man who carried himself with the kind of smug arrogance that came from years of unchecked power. Ariel wasn't the type to cause trouble, but he also wasn't the type to be pushed around. He had followed most of the rules, paid his fees, and kept to himself. But when he decided to install a satellite dish on his roof, he had unknowingly crossed an invisible line. The moment the large metal dish arrived at his house, he had a gut feeling there would be trouble. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct, honed by years of learning to read people and situations before they exploded. That instinct was confirmed when he found the package tampered with, the seal slightly ripped as if someone had peeked inside. A bright yellow sticker was slapped onto the side, marked with the words, "This item may require board approval." He frowned, tearing it off and tossing it aside. As far as he was concerned, the house was his. He didn't need permission to improve his property. That evening, as he carried the heavy dish up onto the roof, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. At first he thought it was nothing, just a shadow shifting as the sun set behind the houses. But when he looked down toward his driveway, he saw someone standing near his garage. The figure was still, almost too still, like they had been watching him for a while. As soon as he turned his head to get a better look, they disappeared behind the neighbor's fence. A chill ran down his spine, not from fear but from the uncomfortable realization that someone had been monitoring him. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Maybe it was just a nosy neighbor. Maybe he was overthinking things. Either way, he wasn't about to stop what he was doing. By the next morning, the real problems began. He woke up to a letter taped to his front door, printed on the same high-quality paper the board used for all their official notices. It was short, almost passive-aggressive in its wording. "Dear Mr. Stanton, it has come to our attention that you are attempting to install an external fixture that does not comply with community aesthetic standards. Please remove it immediately to avoid further action." No signature, no direct accusation, just a warning, wrapped in formal language. Ariel sighed, crumpled the paper, and tossed it onto the kitchen counter. That afternoon, he attended a board meeting to address the issue directly, though he already had a feeling it wouldn't go well. The meeting was held in a sleek, overly polished office building at the edge of the neighborhood. He was the last to arrive, and the moment he stepped into the conference room, the conversation quieted. Arthur Grayson sat at the head of the long wooden table, flanked by his usual group of enforcers, men and women who seemed to thrive on regulating their neighbors' lives. Grayson barely looked up as he gestured for Ariel to take a seat. "Mr. Stanton," Grayson said, his voice smooth and calculated, "we understand you've decided to install a rather disruptive addition to your home." Ariel leaned back in his chair, unimpressed. "It's a satellite dish. Plenty of homes have them." Grayson smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Plenty of homes that aren't part of this community. We have rules, Mr. Stanton. Rules that maintain property values and ensure the visual harmony of the neighborhood. I'm sure you understand. Ariel folded his arms. I read the guidelines before I moved in. Nowhere does it say a satellite dish is prohibited. Grayson's smile didn't waver, but the air in the room changed. Well, some things are subject to board discretion, and we believe your dish falls under that category, so I suggest you take it down before it becomes a bigger issue. It wasn't a request. It was a thinly veiled threat, delivered with the kind of certainty that only came from someone who expected absolute obedience. Ariel held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. I appreciate the concern, he said, his voice steady, but I won't be taking it down. Grayson's expression darkened for just a fraction of a second before he let out a small chuckle. Suit yourself, Mr. Stanton. Just remember there are always consequences for refusing to follow the rules. As Ariel left the meeting, he had the distinct feeling that things were far from over. And he was right. Because 2 days later, his truck was gone. At first he thought it had been stolen, but when he called the towing company, they informed him that his vehicle had been impounded due to unpaid fines issued by the board. Fines he had never received. When he demanded to see proof, they simply directed him back to the board's office. And when he stormed back there, Grayson met him with the same smirk as before, casually sipping from a cup of overpriced coffee. Ah, Mr. Stanton, he said, feigning concern. I see you're having some trouble with your vehicle. Unfortunate, really, but rules are rules. Ariel clenched his jaw. He had dealt with tyrants before, men who ruled through manipulation and intimidation. But this was different. This was personal. Grayson thought he had won. He was wrong. Ariel Stanton had always believed that when someone pushed you, you had two choices: step back or stand your ground. In the past, he had always chosen the latter, but this wasn't a battlefield, and the enemy wasn't carrying a rifle. They hid behind regulations, bureaucracy, and thinly veiled threats. They didn't shoot bullets, they drained you with fines, warnings, and quiet manipulations that turned your own home into hostile territory. Ariel had dealt with his fair share of authoritarians, but something about Arthur Grayson was different. He wasn't just a man enforcing rules, he enjoyed it. He wasn't a leader, he was a king ruling over a tiny kingdom, and like all petty tyrants, he needed people to fear him. Ariel had spent years dealing with men like him, and he knew one thing: they never stopped at the first strike. They kept testing, pushing, escalating, always waiting to see if you would break. That realization became painfully clear the morning after his truck was taken. When he stepped outside to check the mailbox, he immediately noticed something was wrong. His front yard, which had been perfectly maintained, was covered in trash-shredded newspapers, broken glass, and rotting food. It wasn't an accident. Someone had gone out of their way to dump garbage across his lawn, making sure it would be the first thing he saw when he stepped outside. He scanned the street, eyes narrowing as he noticed curtains shifting in windows, neighbors pretending not to watch. Someone had seen who did it, but no one would talk. That was how control worked. You made an example of one person, and the rest learned to stay quiet. Ariel clenched his jaw and went inside to grab a pair of gloves and a trash bag. He had spent too many years dealing with people who thrived on intimidation to let something this petty get under his skin. If they wanted him rattled, they would have to try harder. He spent the next hour cleaning up the mess, methodically picking up every piece of trash, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on him the entire time. He wasn't going to give them the reaction they wanted. But the moment he finished, he found another letter taped to his door. Unlike the official notices from the board, this one was handwritten in thick black ink, the letters pressed so hard into the page that they nearly tore through the paper. You should have listened. He held the note between his fingers for a long moment, considering his options. It wasn't a direct threat, but it didn't have to be. The message was clear: this was just the beginning. He could have gone to the police, filed a report, but he knew how that would play out. Without hard proof, it would be written off as a harmless prank, a misunderstanding, a dispute between neighbors. He had no illusions about the justice system. He had seen how power worked, how influence seeped into places it didn't belong. He wasn't about to waste his time arguing with a bored desk sergeant who would tell him to keep an eye out and let them know if it happens again. No, he would handle this the same way he always had, by staying 5 steps ahead. That night, he installed additional security cameras around his property, positioning them at angles that covered every inch of his yard and driveway. The main cameras were visible, a deterrent for amateurs, but the real ones were hidden small, discreet, placed where no one would think to look. If someone tried to pull something again, he would know exactly who it was. The next few days passed in uneasy silence. No more notes, no more warnings, just the weight of anticipation, the sense that something was coming, like the static in the air before a storm. Ariel kept to his routine, maintaining his property, making his presence known. He refused to act like a man under siege. If they wanted him afraid, they would be disappointed. Then, one evening, as he was locking up for the night, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of movement outside. Not the casual rustling of an animal or the distant footsteps of a passing jogger. This was deliberate. Slow. Calculated. He stood by the front door, listening, waiting. Then came the soft click of a gate latch being lifted. His fingers instinctively tightened around the handle of the knife he kept on the kitchen counter. He didn't move, didn't react, just waited. The sound stopped. Silence stretched. Then, after what felt like an eternity, footsteps retreated, fading into the night. He didn't chase after them. He didn't call out. Instead, he walked to his security monitor, rewound the footage, and watched. The figure was barely visible in the darkness, dressed in black, moving with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before. They had approached the back of the house, tested the gate, then paused as if they had sensed something. Then, just as quickly as they had come, they were gone. Ariel leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just harassment. This wasn't some bored teenagers playing a prank. This was a test. The next morning, another official notice arrived. This time, it wasn't about the satellite dish. It was about his unkept lawn and violation of community noise restrictions. He had lived in the neighborhood long enough to know how these fines worked. They weren't about actual violations, they were about control. They were leverage, tools to make people compliant. They wanted him to break, to fall in line, to submit. But Ariel Stanton had never been the type to submit. That afternoon, he drove straight to the board's office, walked past the receptionist without a word, and entered the conference room where he knew Arthur Grayson would be. The man was seated at the same polished wooden table, flipping through a stack of documents like he had no care in the world. He didn't even look up when Ariel entered. "Mr. Stanton," Grayson said smoothly, finally glancing up. "I assume you're here to discuss the ongoing violations on your property." Ariel placed both hands on the table and leaned in, his voice calm but firm. "I don't play games, Grayson. You want something from me, say it outright. Stop hiding behind fines and warnings like a coward." Grayson's smile didn't falter, but there was something different this time. A flicker of something behind his eyes. Amusement? Contempt? "You seem upset, Mr. Stanton. If you're having difficulty adhering to the community's guidelines, perhaps this isn't the right place for you." Ariel studied him, weighing his words, his tone. He wasn't just trying to force him to comply. He wanted him gone. "You've been doing this a long time, haven't you?" Ariel said quietly. "Pushing people out, making their lives just miserable enough that they give up and sell." Grayson's expression didn't change, but the silence between them was answer enough. Ariel straightened, taking a step back. "I don't scare easy. If you want me out, you'll have to do better than this." Grayson chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, Mr. Stanton, this isn't a battle you can win." Ariel didn't respond. He just turned and walked out, already knowing one thing for certain. This was far from over. Ariel Stanton had spent a lifetime dealing with adversity, but this was something else. This wasn't an open battlefield where you could see your enemy, where the fight was clear and the rules, however brutal, were understood. This was a slow war, a war of pressure, manipulation, and unseen forces pressing against him from every direction. He had been in situations where his decisions had meant life or death, where hesitation could get a man killed. But now, in this quiet suburban battlefield, he found himself fighting something far more insidious, an enemy that worked in the shadows, that eroded resolve piece by piece, waiting for a man to crumble under the weight of 1,000 tiny attacks, rather than a single decisive blow. The day after his confrontation with Grayson, things escalated in a way that left no doubt in his mind that this was more than just a power struggle over a satellite dish. He had expected retaliation, but what happened next was more coordinated than he had anticipated. It began with something seemingly small. His mailbox, which had always stood firmly in place, was suddenly knocked over, the post splintered as if someone had taken a sledgehammer to it. It could have been written off as an accident, except for the neatly folded violation notice tucked inside the broken wood, citing him for failing to properly maintain community property standards. He sighed, shaking his head. This was the game now. They weren't coming for him directly, they were coming for his patience, his sense of security, his ability to simply exist in his own home without constant stress. He knew how psychological pressure worked. Break a man down enough, apply the right amount of weight in the right places, and even the strongest will eventually snap. But they had chosen the wrong target. He didn't snap. He adapted. Instead of reacting immediately, he took his time. He replaced the mailbox that same afternoon, reinforcing it with a steel post buried deep in concrete. If they wanted to destroy it again, they'd need more than brute force. But when he checked his security cameras that evening, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The footage showed a man approaching his house in the dead of night, his face obscured by a hood. He moved with a calculated slowness, carefully avoiding the areas where Uriel had installed motion-detecting lights. The man stood at the edge of the driveway for nearly 5 minutes, not moving, not attempting to enter, just watching. Then, just as eerily as he had arrived, he turned and disappeared into the darkness. Uriel rewound the footage, studying every detail. This wasn't random vandalism. This was a message. Someone was letting him know that they could get close, that they could watch him without him even knowing. It was the kind of psychological warfare that broke weaker men, made them second-guess every shadow, every noise in the night. Ariel had experienced that kind of warfare before, in far more dangerous places, and he knew the only way to respond was not with fear, but with control. He spent the next morning reinforcing his security, adjusting his cameras to capture a wider angle, ensuring there were no blind spots left to exploit. He even installed pressure sensors along the backyard fence, subtle enough that no one would notice them, but effective enough to detect movement. If they wanted to watch him, he'd make sure he was watching right back. But it didn't stop there. The following evening, just after sunset, his power suddenly cut out. The entire house was plunged into darkness, his security monitors going black. He stood still for a moment, listening. There was no storm, no sign of an outage affecting the rest of the neighborhood. Just his house. He reached for his flashlight and moved toward the electrical panel outside, but as soon as he stepped onto the porch, he noticed something strange. The street was quiet. Too quiet. Ariel had lived in enough places to know the sound of an active neighborhood, the distant hum of televisions through windows, the occasional car rolling by, the murmured voices of families settling in for the night. But right now there was nothing, just an unnatural stillness, like the whole street was holding its breath. He moved carefully, his instincts taking over, checking every corner as he made his way around the side of the house. When he reached the electrical box, he saw the problem immediately. The main breaker had been deliberately flipped. But that wasn't what made his stomach tighten. No, it was the small piece of tape stuck to the panel, with a single handwritten word scrawled across it. Enough. He peeled the tape off slowly, exhaling through his nose. Enough of what? Enough of him standing his ground? Enough of him refusing to bend? If they thought this was the moment he would back down, they had no idea who they were dealing with. He flipped the breaker back on, watching as his house came back to life, lights blinking and humming as the security system rebooted. Then he turned on every single floodlight he had installed, illuminating his property like a damn football field. If they wanted to lurk in the shadows, he would take away their shadows entirely. But the real breaking point came 2 days later. He had left the house for only an hour, just long enough to grab some supplies from the hardware store. When he returned, his front door was open. Not broken, not kicked in, just open, swinging slightly in the evening breeze. He stopped at the curb, eyes narrowing, no sign of forced entry. No shattered windows. No footprints on the porch. Whoever had been inside hadn't needed to break in. They had keys. He moved carefully, stepping inside with controlled precision, scanning every corner. Nothing was taken. Nothing was out of place. But there, in the center of his kitchen table, was another note. This one wasn't handwritten. It was typed, printed on the same official stationery the board used for their notices. You don't belong here. Ariel stood motionless, his heartbeat steady, but his muscles coiled like a spring. This was it. The moment where most men would break, where the fear would set in, where the message would be clear: you're not safe. Leave. Give up. Walk away. But Ariel didn't break. He didn't panic. He simply walked to his desk, picked up his phone, and called the one person he knew would take this as seriously as he did. Ben, he said when the attorney picked up, I need you to find out exactly who on that board has access to residence keys, and I need it now. There was a pause, then a quiet, understanding response. Give me an hour. Ariel hung up, took the note, and calmly set it down next to his knife on the counter. He wasn't going anywhere. But whoever had been in his house, they had made their first mistake, and he would make sure it was their last. Ariel Stanton had spent enough time around dangerous men to recognize the shift when it happened. The moment when a game stopped being a game, when intimidation became something sharper, something designed to do more than just frighten. It was the moment things became real. That was what this was. It wasn't about homeowner regulations or aesthetic standards. It wasn't about a satellite dish or compliance with neighborhood policies. It was about control. It was about forcing him to submit, to give in, to accept that he had no power in this place. But Ariel had never been the type to surrender, and that wasn't going to start now. Ben had called back within the hour, just as he had promised. The information he provided wasn't surprising, but it was still infuriating. The board had access to master keys for every house in the community, allegedly for emergency maintenance purposes. The catch was that access was supposed to be tightly restricted, with only 2 people authorized to use them: Arthur Grayson and his vice president, a man named Richard Cole. Except there was no oversight, no requirement that homeowners be informed if their key was used. It was a loophole so large you could drive a truck through it, and Ariel had no doubt that this so-called emergency access had been abused more than once. That's how they got in, Ben had said. They didn't break in because they didn't have to. Ariel had listened, jaw tight, fingers drumming against the counter. How many other people have reported something like this? There was a pause. No one. But that doesn't mean it hasn't happened before. Which meant he was either the first or just the first who hadn't folded under pressure. Ariel had thanked him, ended the call, and sat in silence for a long moment, weighing his options. He could have gone to the police, filed a report, but he already knew how that would play out. He had no proof of forced entry, and the board would simply say they had never used the master key. It would be his word against theirs, and men like Grayson knew how to make people doubt their own reality. No, the police wouldn't be the answer. So Ariel did what he did best. He prepared. That night, he reinforced his locks, installing heavy-duty deadbolts that couldn't be picked. He set up motion sensors along the perimeter of the house, connected directly to his phone. If someone so much as stepped onto his property, he would know about it before they even reached the front door. But the biggest change was inside the house. He moved through each room with practiced efficiency, making subtle adjustments, nothing dramatic, nothing that would be immediately obvious to an untrained eye. He shifted furniture just slightly, repositioned items on shelves, left a thin layer of flowers scattered across the entryway near the back door. A crude trick, but an effective one. If someone entered his house again, he would know. And sure enough, 2 nights later they did. The alert came just past 2 in the morning, a soft vibration against his wrist from the motion sensors. He was awake instantly, adrenaline snapping him into focus. He didn't turn on the lights, didn't make a sound. Instead, he reached for the gun he kept in the drawer beside his bed, a quiet reassurance in his grip as he moved soundlessly through the house. The back door. That's where they had come in. He stayed in the shadows, watching. The figure moved carefully, deliberately, but they weren't as cautious as they thought. They avoided the cameras, but they didn't notice the flower on the floor. A footprint, clear as day, left behind as they stepped further into his house. Ariel waited, heart steady, breath controlled. They moved through his living room, toward his office. And then just as quickly as they had come, they left. No attempt to steal anything, no damage done. Just another message. Another reminder that they could get in whenever they wanted. But this time they had made a mistake. Ariel waited until they were gone, until the night had settled again into silence. Then he moved, quick and efficient, pulling up the security footage, checking the cameras. They had been careful, but not careful enough. The reflection of a face, caught in the glass of his back window, blurry, but recognizable. Richard Cole. So that was it. Grayson's right-hand man, the one who handled the dirty work. Ariel stared at the image for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. Now he had something. Now he had proof. But proof wasn't enough. Not yet. The next day he drove into town, parking a few blocks away from the board's office. He didn't go inside. Instead, he waited, watching. Richard Cole arrived just after noon, stepping out of his car with the casual confidence of a man who had never faced consequences for his actions. Ariel watched him enter the building, then settled in for a long wait. It was nearly 2 hours before Cole left again, and when he did, Ariel followed. Not too close, not obviously, but just enough to see where he was going. The route was familiar back toward the neighborhood, but not toward his own home. Instead, Cole pulled into the driveway of another house, one Ariel recognized. It belonged to an older couple, quiet, kept to themselves. Ariel hadn't spoken to them much, but he knew enough. They had been there for years, long before Grayson had taken control. Ariel watched as Cole knocked on the door, as the old man inside answered, expression wary. There was a brief conversation, then Cole handed him something in an envelope, and just like that, he was gone. Ariel waited until Cole's car disappeared down the street before he stepped out, making his way toward the house. The old man was still standing in the doorway, staring down at the envelope like it might explode. When he noticed Ariel approaching, he hesitated, then sighed. "You should be careful," the man said before Ariel could even speak. "They don't like it when people ask questions." Ariel nodded toward the envelope. "What is it?" The man hesitated, then slowly handed it over. Inside was a letter, formal, cold, efficient. "Due to ongoing violations, your property has been flagged for review. You have 30 days to comply with community standards or further action will be taken." Ariel clenched his jaw. "They're trying to push you out." The old man let out a bitter laugh. "They've been trying for months." And just like that, everything clicked into place. It wasn't just him. It never had been. This was bigger. Grayson and his people weren't just enforcing rules. They were forcing people out. The question was why. Ariel exhaled slowly, handing the envelope back. "You're not alone in this," he said quietly. "Not anymore." The man gave him a long, measuring look, then nodded once. "Then I hope you know what you're doing." Ariel wasn't sure if he did. But one thing was certain, he wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. Ariel Stanton had seen men like Arthur Grayson before, men who built their power not through strength, but through control. They never got their hands dirty, never made the threats themselves. They surrounded themselves with enforcers, people willing to do their bidding, men like Richard Cole, who followed orders without question. That was how they operated. They made people feel powerless, made them believe that resistance was useless, that standing against them was an unwinnable fight. But Ariel wasn't the type to be broken by pressure. If anything, pressure only made him sharper, more focused. And now, with the undeniable proof that Richard had been inside his house, with confirmation that the board had been systematically pushing people out of their homes, he had something far more valuable than just anger. He had clarity. But clarity didn't mean much without action. The next morning, Ariel didn't go to the board's office. He didn't file a complaint or demand answers. Instead, he went straight to Richard's house. It was an older home on the far side of the neighborhood, slightly larger than the others, with a pristine lawn and an expensive black SUV parked in the driveway. He parked his truck across the street, watching for a moment before stepping out. Richard wasn't the kind of man who would admit anything willingly, but Ariel wasn't here for a confession. He was here for a reaction. He knocked once. The door opened almost immediately, as if Richard had been waiting for him. He looked different than he had at the board meetings. No suit, no forced politeness, just a man standing in his doorway, eyes dark with the kind of quiet hostility that didn't need words. "You should leave," Richard said, voice flat. Ariel smiled, slow and deliberate. "I don't take orders from you." For a moment, Richard said nothing. Then he exhaled sharply, stepping outside, pulling the door shut behind him. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he muttered, glancing toward the street as if checking for witnesses. "You think you've figured something out." "I know I have," Ariel said, tone calm. "I know about the forced buyouts. I know you've been using the master keys. And I know that wasn't your first time inside my house." Richard's expression barely flickered, but it was enough. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't confused. He had expected this. Ariel took a step closer, voice dropping just enough to make sure Richard heard every word. "You made a mistake," he said. "You thought I'd scare easy. You thought I'd fold like everyone else. But you don't know me, and now it's too late to fix that mistake." For the first time, something almost like uncertainty crossed Richard's face. Not fear, not yet, but the recognition that this wasn't going to go the way he had expected. He started to say something, but Ariel didn't give him the chance. He turned and walked away, leaving Richard standing in his doorway, fists clenched at his sides. By the time Ariel got home, he knew the retaliation would come fast. And he was right. That night, just after 1 a.m, the motion sensors tripped. This time, they didn't just stand at the edge of the property. They acted. The security cameras caught the first figure moving along the side of the house, dressed in black, face covered. A second figure followed, this one carrying something in his hand, a crowbar. Ariel had expected something like this, had planned for it, and yet watching the footage in real time sent a familiar, steady heat through his veins. They weren't just trying to scare him anymore. They were escalating. He moved quickly, grabbing his phone, hitting the speed dial. "Ben," his voice was calm, measured. "I need you to call the sheriff's office. Tell them I have 2 men on my property with weapons." Ben didn't hesitate. "On it. Stay inside." Ariel stayed on the line as he moved, keeping to the shadows, watching the figures move closer. They didn't know about the secondary cameras, the ones positioned high, covering blind spots. He watched as they hesitated at the back door, as one of them lifted the crowbar, ready to force entry. Then, suddenly, they froze. A floodlight snapped on, flooding the yard with bright white light. The figures reacted instantly, scrambling back toward the fence. Ariel didn't move, didn't go after them. He didn't need to, because less than a minute later, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. They didn't make it out in time. The sheriff's deputies arrived fast, cutting off the exit, ordering the men to the ground. Ariel stayed where he was, watching from the porch as the 2 men were cuffed, as the officers searched them, as Richard Cole's name was spoken aloud by one of the deputies. And just like that, the game had changed. By morning, the news had spread through the neighborhood. 2 men, both with direct ties to the board, had been arrested on Ariel's property. One of them had a record assault charges, years old but still relevant. The other was clean, but that didn't matter. The damage was done. The illusion of authority was cracked. But Ariel knew better than to celebrate. Because men like Arthur Grayson didn't go down without a fight. Sure enough, later that day, an official letter arrived at his door. A formal notice signed by Grayson himself. Due to ongoing violations and failure to comply with community standards, your property has been flagged for immediate review. Further action will be taken. Ariel laughed. A genuine, sharp laugh. He had just caught 2 of Grayson's men trespassing on his property, had them arrested, and this was the response. Another letter? Another attempt to intimidate him with paperwork? He tossed the letter onto the counter and picked up his phone. Ben, he said when his lawyer answered. It's time to go after them. Ben sighed. I was hoping you'd say that. For the next several hours, Ariel worked with Ben to compile everything they had. The security footage, the history of harassment, the violations that had been fabricated, the financial records showing the board's connection to real estate investors who had been quietly buying up properties at suspiciously low prices. It wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger. And then, just before sunset, as Ariel was double-checking his security system, his phone buzzed again. A text. No number. Just a message. Walk away. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he deleted it. And he got back to work. Ariel Stanton had spent enough years in high-stakes situations to know when a fight was reaching its peak. He had seen it in war zones, in negotiations that could mean life or death, in moments where everything balanced on a razor's edge. And now, standing in his own home, staring at the latest attempt to make him back down, he knew he had reached that moment again. The warning text, the escalation in tactics, the direct attempt to break into his home, it was all leading to something bigger. Grayson had finally realized that Ariel wasn't going to fold under pressure, and that meant there was only one move left. Either Grayson had to force him out completely, or Ariel had to take him down first. The next morning, Ben called with news that changed everything. The men who had been caught trespassing on Ariel's property had been released on bail within hours, courtesy of none other than Arthur Grayson himself. That wasn't surprising. What was surprising was that Richard Cole, the board's vice president, had suddenly resigned. No statement, no explanation, just an abrupt departure. It was an attempt to clean house, to make it look like Grayson was severing ties with anyone who could implicate him. But Ariel knew better. Richard hadn't just stepped down. He had been removed, sacrificed to keep Grayson's hands clean. He's trying to shut everything down before it gets worse, Ben said, voice tight with urgency. You need to move now. If we wait, he'll bury whatever evidence is left. Ariel didn't need to be told twice. That afternoon, he and Ben met with a state investigator, presenting everything they had: security footage, financial records, copies of forged violations, evidence of unauthorized home entries. It was more than enough to open an inquiry, but that process would take time. And time wasn't something Ariel had. He knew Grayson wouldn't just sit back and wait for the system to catch up. He would make one final move. The only question was when. The answer came that same night. It started with a sound distant, muffled, but unmistakable. Ariel had been sitting in his living room, watching the live feeds from his security cameras when he heard it. A sharp crack, like wood splintering under pressure. He moved fast, grabbing his gun, heart steady, muscles tense. The motion sensors hadn't gone off, which meant whoever was outside had figured out how to avoid them. That wasn't a coincidence. This was planned. He moved toward the front of the house, silent, controlled, positioning himself near the window. Then another sound, this time closer. A footstep on the porch. Ariel exhaled slowly, adjusting his grip on the gun. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't going to fire blindly. But if someone came through that door, they weren't walking back out. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The porch creaked under shifting weight, then nothing. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Ariel waited, counting the seconds, forcing his breath to stay even. Then, a voice. Low, smooth, deliberately calm. You don't have to do this, Stanton, Grayson. Ariel didn't move, didn't speak. We both know how this ends, Grayson continued, his tone almost conversational. You're alone, no backup, no one coming to help you. Walk away now, and this all goes away. Ariel let the words settle, let them hang in the thick night air. Then, finally, he spoke. You're losing, Grayson. That's why you're here. A pause. Then a quiet chuckle. You're a stubborn man, Grayson said. I respect that. But stubborn men tend to have very short lives. Ariel clenched his jaw, every instinct screaming at him to be ready. You didn't come here to talk, he said, so why don't you cut the bullshit and get to the point? The air shifted, the weight of the moment pressing down. Then another voice, a different one. Boss, a warning. A hesitation. Grayson sighed. You always had to make things difficult, didn't you? Then came the sound of retreating footsteps, slow and deliberate. Ariel kept his stance, gun steady, waiting. A car door opened. An engine turned over. And just like that, they were gone. Ariel exhaled, but he didn't relax. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. By the time morning came, the news had already started spreading. The state investigators had officially opened a case against Grayson and the board, citing multiple allegations of fraud, harassment, and illegal property acquisitions. Subpoenas were being issued. Bank records were being pulled, but Ariel knew that wouldn't be enough. Men like Grayson didn't just disappear quietly. And he was right. That afternoon, Ariel received an email, official, cold, direct. Your home is scheduled for emergency review due to severe non-compliance. Eviction proceedings have been initiated. You have 48 hours to vacate. Ariel stared at the screen, jaw tightening. So this was it. The final move. They couldn't scare him, so they were trying to erase him. He had no doubt the paperwork was fraudulent, that Grayson had manipulated the system to fast-track the process. It didn't matter that he had done nothing wrong. It didn't matter that legal action was already in motion. If they could get him out before the case fully unraveled, then they would win. Except Ariel wasn't going anywhere. He forwarded the email to Ben, who called almost immediately. This is illegal, Ben said, voice tight with barely contained anger. But they don't care. They're hoping you'll panic and leave before we can stop it. I'm not leaving, Ariel said. Ben exhaled sharply. Then we fight. And fight they did. Over the next 24 hours, Ben filed an emergency injunction, blocking the eviction attempt. The legal pressure mounted. More neighbors came forward with their own stories, with their own evidence. The case was growing. The weight of it was becoming too much to ignore. And then, just as the sun was setting, the final blow came. Arthur Grayson was arrested. Fraud, conspiracy, harassment. The charges stacked higher and higher. The system had caught up. The power he had built was collapsing. The game was over. But Ariel didn't celebrate. Not yet. Because men like Grayson always had one last card to play. And Ariel was ready. Ariel Stanton had never been the type to celebrate victories. In his experience, the moment you started feeling safe was the moment you let your guard down, and he knew better than to believe that this was truly over. Arthur Grayson had been arrested, yes, but the wheels of justice turned slowly, and men like him always had contingencies, backup plans, allies in places you wouldn't expect. It wasn't just about putting him in handcuffs, it was about making sure he stayed there. For the next few days, the neighborhood was in chaos. Some residents were relieved, others were scared, and some were angry not at Grayson, but at Ariel. They saw him as the reason everything had fallen apart, as if exposing the corruption had somehow made them victims rather than freeing them from a man who had been bleeding them dry for years. He wasn't surprised. Fear did strange things to people. Those who had quietly suffered under Grayson's rule weren't all suddenly going to stand up and cheer. Many had accepted the oppression, had even justified it, because it was easier to live that way than to fight back. And now, with the old order collapsing, they weren't sure what to do. Ariel stayed quiet, kept to himself, focused on securing what mattered. The emergency injunction had stopped the fraudulent eviction proceedings, and with Grayson in custody, the entire case against the board was gaining traction. More homeowners came forward with their own stories: forced sales, forged violations, intimidation tactics that had driven people out of their homes. The deeper the investigation went, the uglier it became. It wasn't just about Grayson. It was an entire network of corruption stretching beyond the neighborhood, into real estate firms, into law offices, into places where money moved quietly and left no fingerprints. But that was someone else's battle now. Ariel had done his part. He had fought back, exposed the truth, and now it was in the hands of the courts, of the lawyers, of the people whose job it was to clean up the mess. He should have felt satisfied, but he didn't, because there was one thing still bothering him. Richard Cole had vanished. The last time Ariel had seen him was the night of the break-in, the night his men had been arrested. After that, Richard had resigned from the board, cut ties with Grayson, and disappeared. No statements, no attempts to cover for his former boss, no legal action taken against him. He had simply walked away. That wasn't the move of a man who had lost. That was the move of a man who had gotten exactly what he wanted. And that meant something was still in play. Ariel kept his routine normal, knowing that if Richard had any unfinished business, he would make a move soon. He was right. 3 nights after Grayson's arrest, Ariel was sitting on his porch, watching the street, when a black car rolled up to the curb. It wasn't flashy, wasn't distinctive, but it wasn't local either. He knew most of the cars in the neighborhood by now, and this one didn't belong. It idled for a long moment, engine humming softly in the quiet night air. Then, the driver's side door opened, and Richard stepped out. Ariel didn't move, didn't react, just waited as Richard crossed the yard and came to a stop at the base of the porch steps. He looked different, calmer, more controlled. Not a man on the run, but a man who had already accepted whatever was coming next. "You got what you wanted," Richard said after a moment. His voice was steady, but there was something behind it, something just slightly off. Ariel leaned back in his chair, watching him carefully. "Did I?" Richard exhaled, glancing back toward the street. "Grayson was an idiot," he said. "He got greedy, got sloppy, thought he was untouchable. He wasn't." He looked back at Ariel, expression unreadable. "But you already knew that." Ariel didn't respond. He just let the silence stretch, let Richard keep talking. Thing is, Richard continued, Grayson was never the top of the food chain. He was just a piece on the board. And you didn't take down the king, you just knocked over a pawn. Ariel's fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair, a slow, thoughtful rhythm. "And you're here to warn me." Richard gave a small, humorless smile. "No. I'm here to tell you that you have a choice. You can walk away from this, enjoy your little victory, pretend that everything is fine." Or he tilted his head slightly. "You can keep pushing. And if you do, you're going to find out that this goes a lot deeper than some corrupt board members and a few bad real estate deals." Ariel studied him, weighing his words. There was no threat in his tone, no attempt at intimidation. Just a statement of fact, a quiet, undeniable truth. "You're still in the game," Ariel said finally. Richard's smile didn't change. "I never left." Ariel nodded slowly. "Then why are you here?" For the first time, Richard hesitated. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because I owe you one." That wasn't what Ariel had expected. Richard glanced toward the car, then back at Ariel. "I knew what Grayson was doing. I knew how far he was willing to go. And I let it happen because, at the end of the day, I didn't care. But I don't like loose ends, and right now you're a loose end." He exhaled, shaking his head. "So take my advice. Leave it alone. Walk away while you still can." Ariel didn't answer. He just sat there, letting the weight of the words settle. Richard nodded once, as if that was all that needed to be said, then turned and walked back to his car. He didn't look back, didn't wait for a response. Just got in, started the engine, and drove away. Ariel sat there for a long time after that, staring at the empty street. He had won. Grayson was gone. The board was falling apart. The neighborhood was free. And yet, for the first time since this had all started, he wasn't sure if he had actually won anything at all. Because Richard was right. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And the only question left was whether he was going to let it go, or whether he was going to finish what he started.